In the summer of 1778, George Washington wrote a letter to a 24-year-old cavalry officer named Benjamin Tallmadge that contained a request so unusual, so far outside the normal duties of a Continental Army dragoon, that Tallmadge reportedly read it twice before he was sure he understood what was being asked. Washington needed a spy network, not an informant, not a loyalist who would pass along gossip for money. A full intelligence operation with multiple agents, coded communications, invisible ink, dead drops, and cover identities, operating inside British-occupied New York City, the most heavily fortified and most carefully watched piece of real estate in North America. He needed it built from scratch, in secret, by a man who had never done anything like it before, using people who had no training in intelligence work and no particular reason to risk their lives beyond their own belief in a cause that, in the summer of 1778, was far from obviously going to succeed. And he needed it to work.
Tallmadge said yes. He went home to Long Island, where he had grown up and where he knew the land, the people, the roads, and the rhythms of communities now living under British occupation. He looked at what he had, the way Morgan had looked at his militia before Cowpens, and the way Themistocles had looked at a silver mine 6 years before Salamis, and he started building something out of it. What he built was the Culper Ring, and what the Culper Ring built over the next 3 years was a shadow intelligence operation so effective that it changed the outcome of multiple engagements, exposed one of the most damaging traitors in American history, and gave Washington a window into British intentions that no amount of battlefield reconnaissance could have provided. None of the people who built it were soldiers. None of them were trained intelligence officers. They were farmers, merchants, a printer, a tavern keeper, a woman hanging laundry on a clothesline. They operated in plain sight in a city full of British soldiers, using a system so carefully designed that the British never fully penetrated it. To understand how they did it, you have to start with what they were up against.
New York under the King. By 1778, New York City had been under British occupation for nearly 2 years, and the British had used that time to transform it into the most effective military base in North America. The city itself, which in 1778 meant the lower tip of Manhattan, roughly below what is now Chambers Street, held approximately 33,000 people, of whom a substantial portion were British soldiers, Hessian mercenaries, loyalist civilians who had come from other parts of the colonies to live under Crown protection, and the various camp followers, merchants, and opportunists that any major military garrison attracts. British fortifications ringed the island. Warships patrolled the harbor. Loyalist informants were everywhere, and the British military intelligence operation under Major John André was genuinely competent.
André was the other figure in this story. He was young, 28 when the spy network started, 30 when he died. Charming, talented, and deeply respected by both sides. Washington himself called him a man of honor after his execution. He was also, as head of British intelligence operations, Tallmadge's direct adversary, the man trying to detect exactly the kind of operation that Tallmadge was building. André ran his intelligence network with a combination of paid informants, intercepted mail, and infiltrators who moved through patriot communities in New Jersey and the Hudson Valley. His operation was well-funded and methodical. He understood that intelligence in a war of this kind was as important as any military engagement, possibly more so. Tallmadge understood the same thing. The question was how to build something that could function inside André's territory without André finding it. The answer was structure, specifically the kind of compartmentalized structure that meant no single arrest could unravel the entire operation. The architecture of secrets. The Culper Ring, as Tallmadge designed it, did not function like a traditional spy operation where agents reported directly to a handler who reported to a commander. It functioned like a chain, where each link knew only the links immediately adjacent to it. Abraham Woodhull, a farmer from Setauket on Long Island's North Shore, became the primary collector of intelligence inside New York City and on Long Island. He operated under the codename Samuel Culper Jr., the name that gave the ring its identity. Woodhull was not a bold man by temperament. He was cautious, anxious, frequently terrified by what he was doing, and convinced throughout most of his years as an agent that he was about to be caught. He wrote to Tallmadge regularly about his fears. He asked repeatedly to be relieved of his duties. He was also meticulous, careful, and effective, and Tallmadge kept him in place because the fear that made Woodhull miserable was also what made him careful enough to survive. To actually operate in New York City, Woodhull needed someone with a legitimate reason to be there. He recruited Robert Townsend, a Manhattan merchant and sometime journalist who had a dry goods shop on Pearl Street and wrote occasional pieces for a loyalist newspaper called Rivington's Gazette. Townsend became Samuel Culper Jr. He was, if anything, even more anxious about his role than Woodhull. He hated the work, was convinced it would get him killed, and kept trying to quit. He was also exceptional at it.
Townsend's position was close to perfect for an intelligence agent. He had a legitimate business that brought British officers into his shop. He wrote for a loyalist newspaper, which gave him access to British social circles and conversation. He was quiet and unassuming, the kind of man that people talk around without quite registering his presence. He sat behind his counter, listened to officers discuss military plans over the goods he was selling them, went home and wrote it down. The intelligence then had to move from Manhattan to Washington's headquarters in New Jersey, and this is where the operational design becomes genuinely elegant. Townsend passed his written reports to a courier, initially a series of different individuals, eventually settling primarily on Austin Roe, a tavern keeper from Setauket, who had a legitimate commercial reason to travel regularly between Manhattan and Long Island to purchase supplies. Roe would bring the intelligence to Woodhull. Woodhull would pass it to Caleb Brewster, a whaleboat captain who ran a smuggling and raiding operation across Long Island Sound to Connecticut that gave him cover for regular water crossings. Brewster would bring the intelligence to Tallmadge on the Connecticut shore. Tallmadge would forward it to Washington. 5 people, each knowing only their immediate neighbors in the chain. No single person, if arrested, could give up more than 1 or 2 names. British counterintelligence would have needed to arrest and interrogate the right person at every stage simultaneously to unravel the operation in a single move. They never managed it.
The most famous story from the Culper Ring, and one that historians have debated for 2 centuries in terms of exactly how literally to read it, involves a woman known to history as Agent 355. The number 355 appeared in the Culper Ring's codebook as the designation for lady. Beyond that, the historical record is frustratingly thin. Her real name was never written down in any document that has survived. The secrecy that protected her identity during her lifetime has made her something of a ghost in the historical record. What the sources do establish is that there was a female agent operating within the Culper network who had access to British social circles in New York that the male agents could not penetrate. She moved in the world of loyalist society, attended the gatherings where British officers socialized, and passed intelligence through the network that proved, on at least one occasion, critical.
The clothesline story comes from a slightly different but connected piece of the network's operation. Anna Strong, the wife of a Patriot prisoner held by the British, lived on the north shore of Long Island near Brewster's landing points. She is credited in some accounts with using her clothesline to signal Woodhull about Brewster's location. A black petticoat hanging meant Brewster was in the area and a message was waiting, and the number of handkerchiefs indicated which of several coves he was using. Whether this specific signaling system was precisely as described, or whether the account has been shaped by later retelling, the broader point is accurate. The Culper Ring used women in ways that British counterintelligence was not fully prepared to monitor, because the British assumptions about who could be an intelligence operative did not adequately account for people outside the military or merchant class. A woman hanging laundry on a line was invisible to British intelligence in a way that a man carrying papers was not. Tallmadge, deliberately or instinctively, had built an operation that used the blind spots of his opponent's assumptions about who mattered.
The invisible ink and the codebook. Two technical tools gave the Culper Ring a layer of security that would have been unavailable to a less carefully organized operation. The first was invisible ink, developed by a patriot physician named James J., the brother of John J., who would later become the first Chief Justice of the United States. The ink was a chemical compound that left no visible trace on paper when written and could only be revealed by applying a specific reagent. Agents wrote their intelligence reports in invisible ink between the lines of ordinary, innocent-looking letters. A British officer intercepting the letter would see a routine piece of correspondence. Only the recipient, with the matching reagent, would see the hidden message. The ink was not a party trick. It was a genuine operational security measure that protected agents whose letters were likely to be searched. Austin Roe's regular trips between Manhattan and Long Island meant that his correspondence and packages were subject to inspection. The invisible ink meant that even a thorough search of his possessions would not necessarily reveal what was being carried. The second tool was the codebook. Tallmadge developed a numbering system that replaced common words, names, and places with numbers. New York was 727, Washington was 711, Tallmadge himself was 721, Long Island was 728. The numbers meant that even a decoded letter, one written in visible ink, would be uninterpretable to someone who did not have the corresponding codebook. A British officer reading an intercepted Culper message would see references to 711 directing operations from 728 through 745 with the assistance of 723 and have no idea what any of it meant. The combination of physical concealment through invisible ink and semantic concealment through codes gave the network a double layer of protection that made interception essentially useless even when it occurred.
What the network discovered. The Culper Ring is often discussed in terms of its structure and methods because those are genuinely remarkable, but the structure and methods only matter insofar as they produced intelligence that changed outcomes. And they did. The most consequential single piece of intelligence the Ring produced came in the summer of 1780 and is by any measure one of the most important acts of espionage in the Revolutionary War. In July of 1780, a French fleet under the Comte de Rochambeau arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, carrying 5,500 French soldiers who would eventually march with Washington to Yorktown and help end the war. Their arrival was a significant boost to the American cause. It was also immediately a target. The British in New York knew the French had landed in Newport. They planned a naval strike on the French fleet while it was still in port, before the French could establish proper shore defenses, before the ships could be properly positioned, before Rochambeau's force was ready to operate effectively. A successful attack on the French fleet at Newport would have eliminated one of the most important military assets the Americans had gained in years and potentially crippled the Franco-American alliance at a moment when it was just beginning to function.
Townsend, Robert Townsend, the anxious dry goods merchant on Pearl Street, learned of the planned attack through his connections in Loyalist society. He wrote it up and passed it through the chain, to Roe, to Woodhull, to Brewster, to Tallmadge, to Washington. The speed of the transmission was critical. Tallmadge had built the chain partly with speed in mind, ensuring that time-sensitive intelligence could reach Washington before it became irrelevant. Washington received the warning. He forwarded it to Rochambeau with a letter explaining what the British were planning. Rochambeau had time to prepare, to position his defenses, and to bring his force to a state of readiness that made the British attack look far less appealing when the actual assessment was made. The British called off the Newport attack. The French fleet that would seal the Chesapeake at Yorktown in 1781, cutting off Cornwallis's escape route and making his surrender inevitable, was the same fleet that had been sitting at Newport in July 1780. The Culper Ring's warning kept it there. That is the thread. Newport to Yorktown runs through a dry goods merchant in Manhattan who wrote an intelligence report in invisible ink.
The traitor they found.
The most dramatic single moment in the Culper Ring's operational history did not involve a battle, a fleet, or a military campaign. It involved a name on a piece of paper and a pair of boots. In September 1780, John André was traveling through Westchester County in New York when he was stopped by 3 American militiamen, John Paulding, Isaac Van Wart, and David Williams, who searched him and found papers hidden in his boot. The papers contained detailed plans of the fortifications at West Point, the critical American garrison controlling the Hudson River. They contained the garrison's defensive weaknesses, the number of troops, the placement of artillery. André was arrested and eventually executed. But the more important question, how had the plans gotten to him and who had given them, was answered by the papers themselves and by the investigation that followed. The traitor was Benedict Arnold. Arnold had been in command at West Point and had been secretly negotiating its surrender to the British for over a year. He had been communicating with André throughout that period, passing military information in exchange for money and eventually a British commission.
The Culper Ring's direct connection to the André capture is historically contested. Some accounts credit Agent 355 with first flagging suspicious activity around Arnold. Others suggest the capture of André by the militiamen was genuinely accidental, the right men in the right place rather than a coordinated intelligence operation. The full picture of what the Culper network knew and when it knew it is obscured by the same careful secrecy that protected the ring during its operation. What is not contested is the aftermath. Tallmadge was the officer who conducted the interrogation of André after his capture. He spent the days between the arrest and the execution in André's company, and later wrote about those conversations with a mixture of genuine respect for André's character and complete clarity about what his execution required. The 2 men, the intelligence officer who had built the American spy network and the intelligence officer who had run the British one, spent several days in close conversation while one of them waited to be hanged. They understood each other better than almost anyone else on either side understood what they had both been doing. André was executed on October 2, 1780. Arnold escaped to the British lines on the morning his treason was discovered and spent the rest of his life in British service, a man neither side fully trusted.
The officer nobody remembers. Tallmadge came home from the war and became a congressman from Connecticut. He served 5 terms in the House of Representatives, lived to 80 years old, and died in 1835, having watched the country he had helped spy into existence grow from 13 fractious colonies into a continental republic. He wrote a memoir. In it, he discussed the Culper Ring in terms that were careful even in retrospect, protective even of people who were decades dead. The habits of the intelligence officer, the instinct to reveal only what is necessary, to protect sources and methods even after they have ceased to matter operationally, stayed with him long after the war was over. The Ring's members scattered into ordinary life. Woodhull went back to farming in Setauket. Brewster continued his waterborne activities in Long Island. Roe ran his tavern. Townsend, the most reluctant agent of all, the man who had wanted to quit from almost the beginning, returned to his merchant business and never publicly acknowledged his role in the Ring during his lifetime. His identity as Samuel Culper Jr. was not confirmed until 1930, when a historian named Morton Pennypacker compared handwriting samples from Culper letters against known samples of Townsend's writing. For 150 years after the war, the man who had sat in his dry goods shop on Pearl Street, listening to British officers and writing their plans down in invisible ink, was unknown. That anonymity was, in a way, the final proof of the Ring's quality. An intelligence network that protected its members' identities so completely that some of them remained unknown for a century and a half was not a network that had been penetrated. The British never broke it. André never identified it. The most carefully watched city in North America contained, for 3 years, an intelligence operation that the British occupation could not find.
What Washington understood.
Washington was, throughout the war, obsessed with intelligence to a degree that his contemporaries sometimes found puzzling, and his biographers have only recently begun to fully credit. He ran multiple networks simultaneously. He used double agents to feed disinformation to the British. He developed the use of forged documents, fake camp layouts, and fabricated orders to deceive British commanders about American intentions. He understood, in a way that most military commanders of his era did not, that knowing the enemy's plans before they were executed was worth more than almost any tactical advantage on the battlefield. The Culper Ring was his finest instrument, but the reason it was his finest instrument was not just that Tallmadge built it well, though he did. It was that Washington understood what it needed and gave Tallmadge the latitude to build it properly. He did not micromanage the ring. He did not demand constant reports or insist on knowing operational details that were safer kept from him. He trusted Tallmadge's judgment on how to run the network, supplied the invisible ink and the code books and the money for payments, and received the product without compromising the people who produced it.
This is the part of Washington's leadership that tends to get lost in the stories about crossing frozen rivers and giving speeches to the troops. He built an intelligence apparatus that functioned effectively because he understood that effective intelligence requires patience, compartmentalization, and the willingness to operate in shadow for months without visible results. He waited, he paid, he protected his sources, and the ring produced. The specific intelligence about Newport in 1780 is the most documentable result, but there were others. Reports about British force dispositions, about planned raids, about loyalist activity in contested areas that shaped Washington's operational decisions throughout the 3 years the ring was active in ways that cannot always be traced directly, but whose aggregate effect on his ability to understand his enemy's intentions was substantial. He was fighting a war with imperfect information, as all commanders do. The Culper Ring made his information considerably less imperfect than his opponents.
The streets they walked. The Pearl Street where Townsend had his dry goods shop is still there in Lower Manhattan, though nothing about the current streetscape would give you any sense of what happened there between 1778 and 1781. The financial district has buried the colonial street grid under layers of later construction. Setauket on Long Island is better preserved. The North Shore of Long Island retains enough of its 18th century character that you can stand in the village and understand what Woodhull's world looked like. The church where some of the ring's meetings may have taken place is still standing. The harbor where Brewster's whaleboats crossed to Connecticut is the same harbor. In 2024, Setauket is a quiet suburb of New York City, an hour on the Long Island Railroad from Penn Station. On a summer morning, it looks like exactly what it is, a pleasant Long Island town on the water, comfortable and unremarkable. On summer mornings in 1779, a farmer named Woodhull was writing up his intelligence reports in invisible ink in that town, terrified of what he was doing, certain he was about to be caught, and doing it anyway. On those same mornings, a merchant in Manhattan was listening to British officers over his counter and memorizing what they said. A tavern keeper was planning his next supply run to the city. A whaleboat captain was checking the weather over Long Island Sound. None of them knew exactly what the others were doing. None of them had to. The structure that Tallmadge had built meant that each of them only needed to know their part.
Washington, in his headquarters in New Jersey, was waiting for what they would send him. It came. It always came. Through the invisible ink and the numbered code and the clothesline signals and the whaleboat crossings, it came. And the war that those ordinary people helped win by doing extraordinary things in silence is the reason that the country where their streets now sit exists at all. The Culper Ring never fired a shot. It never held a position or charged a battery or crossed a frozen river under fire. What it did was quieter and in its own way just as decisive. It told Washington what the British were planning before the British could plan it. In 3 years of operation, the most carefully watched city on the continent never found it. That is the measure of what Tallmadge built.